February 1945. The 33rd Waffen-Grenadier Division der SS Charlemagne arrived in eastern Pomerania as the German defensive position in the region approached total collapse. Approximately 7,000 French volunteers detrained at scattered railway junctions between February 16th and February 20th, dispersing immediately into a front that no longer existed as a continuous defensive line. The division's arrival coincided with the final stages of the Soviet East Pomeranian offensive, launched on February 10th by elements of the Second Belarusian Front under Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky. Soviet forces had already penetrated German defensive positions at multiple points. The Wehrmacht's Second Army, responsible for the sector, was disintegrating under pressure from overwhelming Soviet material superiority. French units detrained at night to avoid Soviet air interdiction, which had achieved near total air superiority over Pomerania. The Luftwaffe was effectively absent from the region. Daylight movement of trains meant certain destruction. Even at night, Soviet aircraft conducted harassment missions against rail traffic. The French volunteers wore standard Wehrmacht Feldgrau uniforms with Waffen-SS insignia. On their collars, alongside the SS runes, was a small tricolour shield, red, white, and blue. These were not conscripts. Every man had volunteered for service on the Eastern Front, though their motivations varied considerably. The division consisted primarily of two distinct groups. The first comprised veterans of the Legion of French Volunteers Against Bolshevism, the LVF, which had operated on the Eastern Front since late 1941. These men had combat experience, understood Eastern Front warfare, and possessed no illusions about what awaited them. They numbered perhaps 2,000. The second group consisted of fugitives from liberated France. Following the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944 and the subsequent liberation of France, thousands of collaborators faced arrest, trial, and execution. Many fled east into Germany. When the Charlemagne Division was formed in autumn 1944, these men constituted the majority of its strength. They were fleeing certain death in France. Pomerania offered only probable death, which represented an improvement in odds. A smaller contingent consisted of genuine ideological volunteers, men who viewed the war as a crusade against Bolshevism and believed in the National Socialist vision of a united Europe. These men were a minority, but they were often among the most fanatical fighters. Training had been rushed and incomplete. The division had been assembled at camps in southern Germany beginning in September 1944, with an intended strength of 11,000 men organized into two infantry regiments, the 57th and 58th, plus supporting artillery, anti-tank, and engineer battalions. By January 1945, training was far from complete when urgent orders arrived from Berlin demanding immediate deployment. Upon arrival in Pomerania, French units were dispersed along a front of approximately 40 kilometers between Neustetten and Hammerstein. There was no time for reconnaissance, no opportunity for units to familiarize themselves with terrain, and no possibility of conducting coordinated defensive planning. German liaison officers simply directed French companies to positions and told them to hold. Soviet artillery fire was audible from every unloading point. The continuous rumble of bombardment rolled across the frozen landscape day and night. The sound never stopped. It served as a constant reminder that the Red Army was close and advancing. Temperature in mid-February ranged from -15 to -22 degrees Celsius. The ground was frozen solid. Digging defensive positions required hours of work with picks and explosives. Many French soldiers, particularly those who had arrived recently from France, had never experienced winter of this severity. Frostbite became a significant casualty category within the first week. The French volunteers moved east on foot from railway junctions toward their assigned positions. Soviet forces controlled the roads during daylight. Movement occurred at night through forests and across frozen fields. Units became separated. Companies lost contact with their parent battalions. The division's command structure began fragmenting before it had engaged in a single action. SS Brigadeführer Gustav Krukenberg, the division's German military commander, established a headquarters at a location southwest of Neustetten. Communication with subordinate units was maintained primarily through motorcycle couriers, as Soviet artillery systematically destroyed telephone lines, and radio equipment was in short supply. General Edgar Poirot, the French political commander, held nominal authority but possessed limited actual control over tactical operations. German commanders at corps and army level gave orders directly to French battalion commanders when circumstances required immediate action. The French command structure was bypassed routinely during the first week of deployment. By February 24th, the entire division was in position along the collapsing Pomeranian front. Soviet forces were already probing defensive lines. Contact was established through artillery exchanges and patrol clashes. The French volunteers prepared defensive positions and waited for the attack they knew was inevitable. To understand how French soldiers came to fight in SS uniforms on the Eastern Front in 1945, it is necessary to examine the origins of French collaboration and Eastern Front volunteering that began in 1941. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet frontier in the largest military operation in history. Within days, German armoured spearheads had advanced hundreds of kilometres into Soviet territory. For significant segments of French political opinion, particularly on the right, this represented the war they had wanted to fight, not against Britain or America, but against Bolshevism. The French Communist Party had been powerful in the 1930s, organising strikes that disrupted French rearmament efforts between 1937 and 1939. French conservatives viewed communists as internal enemies who had weakened France during the critical years before the war. Within weeks of Barbarossa's launch, collaborationist organizations across occupied France began recruiting volunteers for what they termed a crusade against Bolshevism. The Legion of French Volunteers Against Bolshevism, Légion des Volontaires Français contre le Bolchevisme, or LVF, was authorized by German authorities in July 1941. Vichy France officially opposed the formation but did not actively prevent recruitment. Propaganda emphasized that volunteers would fight exclusively against the Soviet Union, never against France's former allies, Britain or America. Recruitment posters showed French and German soldiers standing together against the Asiatic hordes threatening European civilization. The campaign explicitly framed the war in ideological rather than national terms. By autumn 1941, approximately 3,000 volunteers had been recruited and formed into the 638th Infantry Regiment. Training began at German facilities in Poland. German instructors found the French volunteers politically motivated but militarily undisciplined. Reports from training cadres noted that French soldiers questioned orders, complained about conditions, and displayed poor military bearing compared to Wehrmacht standards. In November 1941, the LVF was deployed to the Moscow sector as winter approached. What followed was a catastrophic introduction to Eastern Front warfare. The winter of 1941-42 remains one of the coldest on record in the Western Soviet Union. Temperatures dropped below -40 degrees Celsius. The LVF, inadequately equipped for extreme cold, suffered massive casualties from frostbite, exposure, and disease. Dysentery swept through the ranks. Men who had never experienced severe winter found themselves in conditions that killed through simple exposure. Combat, when it came, was equally devastating. Soviet doctrine emphasized massed artillery preparation followed by infantry assault in depth. The LVF found itself subjected to bombardments lasting hours, destroying positions and inflicting psychiatric casualties even when physical casualties were limited. Soviet infantry attacked in successive waves, accepting heavy losses to maintain momentum. French defensive performance was uneven. Some positions were held successfully, others collapsed under pressure. German commanders wrote assessments noting that the LVF was adequate for static defensive operations in quiet sectors, but unsuitable for mobile warfare or offensive operations. By spring 1942, the LVF had suffered over 800 casualties from combat, frostbite, disease, and desertion. The unit was withdrawn to rear areas for reconstitution. For the next 2 years, it rotated through various sectors of the Eastern Front, never dissolving entirely, but never achieving the combat effectiveness required for major operations. The LVF conducted anti-partisan operations in occupied Soviet territories throughout 1942 and 1943. These operations were brutal. Soviet partisans did not observe Geneva Convention protections for prisoners, neither did German anti-partisan forces. In static defensive positions, the LVF performed adequately. Individual French soldiers gained combat experience. Some distinguished themselves, others were killed or invalided out with wounds or illness. The formation slowly accumulated veterans who understood Eastern Front warfare, but overall strength declined as casualties exceeded replacements. Then came June 6, 1944, D-Day. The Allied invasion of Normandy transformed the strategic situation for French collaborators. Within weeks, France was being liberated. The resistance, which had operated underground during occupation, emerged openly and began settling scores. Collaborators faced summary execution, imprisonment, or show trials followed by execution. There was no amnesty, no middle ground. Thousands fled. Some attempted to hide in remote areas of France. Others fled east into Germany, correctly calculating that Germany offered temporary safety even as it approached defeat. German authorities, desperate for manpower, saw opportunity. In July 1944, Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler ordered consolidation of all French volunteer formations into a single Waffen-SS division. The scattered LVF would be withdrawn from the Eastern Front and reconstituted as the core of the new formation. The Sturmbrigade Frankreich, another French volunteer unit, would be incorporated. French SS volunteers serving in other units would be gathered. The result would be the 33rd Waffen-Grenadier Division der SS Charlemagne. The name carried deliberate symbolism. Charlemagne, Carolus Magnus, Charles the Great, the Frankish king who united much of Europe under Christian rule in the 8th and 9th centuries. The propaganda message was clear. This division fought for a united Europe against the Bolshevik East. It was ideological framing intended to elevate collaboration from treason to crusade. In reality, the division was a hastily assembled collection of fugitives, fanatics, and combat veterans being thrown into a collapsing front because German manpower had been exhausted. Formation began at training camps in southern Germany in autumn 1944. The division's organization followed standard Waffen-SS Grenadier Division structure on paper: 2 infantry regiments of 3 battalions each, plus supporting artillery, anti-tank, engineer, and service units. Intended strength was 11,000 men. Actual strength never approached this figure. By January 1945, the division fielded approximately 7,000 men, and many supporting units existed only on organizational charts. Artillery was under strength, anti-tank capabilities were limited, engineer support was minimal. SS Brigade Führer Gustav Krukenberg was appointed military commander. Krukenberg was a German career officer with extensive Eastern Front experience dating to 1941. He had commanded combat units in multiple sectors and understood the operational realities of late war fighting. He was professional, competent, and utterly without illusions about Germany's strategic position. General Edgar Paud held nominal political command. Paud was 52 years old, a career French army officer who had served with the LVF since 1941. He had combat experience and was respected by French volunteers, but he was viewed with suspicion by German commanders who considered him too political and insufficiently ruthless for Eastern Front combat. Under Paud served younger, harder officers. SS Hauptsturmführer Henri Fenet commanded elements of the 57th Regiment. Fenet was 32 years old and a veteran of years of Eastern Front combat. He had been wounded multiple times. He was a true believer, a political fanatic who would fight until physically incapable of continuing. Among the rank and file was Christian de la Mazière, a 19-year-old volunteer who would later write a memoir describing his motivations with painful honesty. He had wanted adventure, wanted to prove himself in combat, believed he was defending Europe against barbarism. By January 1945, training was incomplete when urgent orders arrived from Berlin. The Red Army had launched the Vistula-Oder offensive on January 12th. German defensive lines across Poland had collapsed. Soviet armor was racing westward toward the Oder River and Berlin. Every available unit was required immediately. The Charlemagne Division was loaded onto trains and sent east to Pomerania. It was not ready. Equipment was inadequate. Training was incomplete. Organization was unfinished. None of this mattered. The Eastern Front was collapsing, and Germany needed bodies to slow the Soviet advance, even temporarily. The French volunteers were about to receive a brutal education in what combat against the Red Army actually meant in the final months of the war. February 25, 1945, elements of the French 57th Regiment detrained at Hammerstein Railway Junction in darkness and moved immediately northeast toward defensive positions approximately 3 kilometers from the station. Soviet forces had penetrated German lines during the previous 48 hours. French units were being committed piecemeal to plug gaps in a front that no longer existed as a continuous defensive line. SS Hauptsturmführer Henri Fenet commanded the regiment's lead battalion. Temperature at dawn was -18 Celsius. French soldiers marched through snow carrying weapons, ammunition, and equipment on their backs. There were no transport vehicles available. Everything moved on foot. At approximately 900 hours, the French battalion reached its assigned defensive position, a low rise overlooking frozen fields with scattered woodlots. The position had been abandoned by its previous defenders during the night. No prepared fortifications existed. Trenches were shallow and poorly positioned. There was no barbed wire, no mines, no cleared fields of fire. Fenet immediately positioned his companies for defense. Machine gun teams were placed on the flanks to provide interlocking fire across the approach routes. Riflemen began improving the shallow trenches using entrenching tools, though the frozen ground resisted digging. Anti-tank teams with Panzerfaust rockets were positioned in forward positions with clear lines of sight. At 11:20 hours, a French observation post reported movement to the northeast. Armor was approaching. The tanks appeared on the horizon as black shapes against white snow. Initial count, approximately 20 T-34 tanks advancing in a broad front without apparent infantry support. This represented a Soviet tactical error. Tanks attacking without infantry were vulnerable to close-range anti-tank weapons, but it also suggested that Soviet forces were moving so rapidly that combined arms coordination was breaking down. The T-34/85, armed with an 85mm main gun, was the standard Soviet medium tank in 1945. At 11:35 hours, at a range of approximately 1,200 meters, the T-34s opened fire while advancing. Initial rounds impacted in the rear areas of the French position. Accuracy was poor at long range while moving, but the volume of fire was considerable. Fenet ordered his men to hold fire. Panzerfaust rockets had an effective range of approximately 60 meters. Firing at long range was wasteful and ineffective. The tanks had to be allowed to close before engagement. The T-34s continued advancing. At 1,000 meters, their fire became more accurate. A direct hit destroyed a French machine gun position, killing 3 men instantly. The ground shook with each impact. High explosive shells carved craters in the frozen earth. At 800 meters, the tanks reached hull-down positions behind slight terrain features. They fired methodically, working over the French position with sustained bombardment. Casualties mounted. Men were killed by direct hits or by concussion that ruptured blood vessels and organs. At 600 meters, Fenet authorized machine gun fire. 2 MG-42s opened up from the flanks. The MG-42's rate of fire, 1,200 rounds per minute, created a distinctive sound and sent streams of tracer fire toward the advancing armor. The rounds bounced harmlessly off tank armor, but the purpose was to engage any infantry that might be following. There was none. The tanks were advancing alone. At 400 meters, a French soldier fired a Panzerfaust prematurely. The rocket was fired at 4 times its effective range and missed by a wide margin. Fenet shouted for fire discipline. Anti-tank teams were to wait for targets to close to under 100 meters. The T-34s kept advancing, firing continuously. Soviet tank doctrine emphasized aggressive forward movement. Soviet crews were trained to close with enemy positions and destroy them through direct fire and shock effect. At 200 meters, another Panzerfaust fired and struck a T-34 on the glacis plate at a poor angle. The shaped charge warhead detonated but failed to penetrate. The tank continued advancing. At ranges under 100 meters, French anti-tank teams began engaging effectively. Panzerfaust rockets, fired from close range, struck T-34s on the turret sides and flanks where armor was thinner. Shaped charge warheads penetrated crew compartments. Tanks stopped moving. Some burned, others simply became immobile, crews killed or incapacitated. In approximately 6 minutes of close-range engagement, French anti-tank teams destroyed or disabled 7 T-34 tanks. The remainder withdrew to covered positions at longer range. The immediate attack was repulsed. French casualties from the engagement: 14 killed, 23 wounded. This represented approximately 10% of the battalion's strength eliminated in a single action lasting less than 30 minutes. At 12:40 hours, Soviet artillery opened fire on the French position. The barrage was systematic and thorough. Shells fell continuously for 90 minutes. The French could do nothing except shelter in their inadequate trenches and endure. The bombardment inflicted psychiatric casualties, even where physical casualties were limited. Men emerged from the shelling deafened, concussed, bleeding from ears and noses. At 14:10 hours, the artillery fire ceased. 60 seconds later, Soviet infantry attacked. They advanced in waves, company-strength formations moving forward in loose order across the snow. Soviet doctrine emphasized momentum over careful tactics. Infantry fired PPSH submachine guns while advancing. Casualties were immediately replaced from follow-on waves. The attack never paused. French defenders who survived the artillery barrage engaged at maximum range. MG-42 fire cut down Soviet infantry at 300 meters. Riflemen fired methodically, but the Soviets kept coming. When one wave was decimated, another advanced behind it. The mathematics were brutal and inevitable. The Soviets possessed unlimited replacements. The French had none. Every casualty was permanent. The defensive position would eventually be overrun through simple attrition. At 15:50 hours, with Soviet infantry penetrating the flanks of the position, Fonet ordered withdrawal. Under covering fire from machine guns, French soldiers abandoned their trenches and fell back 300 meters to a secondary line that had not been prepared. They ran across open snow while Soviet fire pursued them. Additional casualties were taken during the withdrawal. By 16:30 hours, what remained of the French battalion, approximately 60% of its original strength, had established a new defensive position in a tree line behind their original position. The engagement at Hammerstein was over. The French had held for approximately 7 hours against sustained Soviet pressure. They had destroyed multiple tanks. They had inflicted significant casualties on Soviet infantry. And they had learned the fundamental reality of Eastern Front combat in early 1945. Tactical skill and individual courage were insufficient against overwhelming material superiority and unlimited replacements. That night, survivors sat in the frozen darkness and absorbed the lesson. The Red Army could lose 100 men for every German or French casualty and still achieve victory through simple arithmetic. The war was already decided. What remained was determining how many would die before the inevitable end. March 1st to 4th, 1945. The Soviet offensive in Pomerania achieved multiple breakthroughs along the entire front. The Wehrmacht's Second Army, responsible for defending the region, was shattered. German defensive cohesion collapsed. Units became isolated. Supply lines were cut. Command and control disintegrated. The Charlemagne Division, never fully integrated as a cohesive formation, fragmented completely. Battalions were separated from their parent regiments. Companies lost contact with battalion headquarters. Platoons fought isolated actions without awareness of whether neighboring units still existed. The battle evolved from mobile operations into chaotic street fighting in towns and villages across Pomerania. At Neustetten, elements of the French 58th Regiment conducted fighting withdrawals through burning streets as Soviet forces entered from multiple directions. Buildings were cleared, room by room, grenades were thrown through windows, automatic weapons fired at point-blank range in hallways and basements. The pattern repeated across dozens of locations. Soviet artillery would bombard a town for hours, systematically destroying defensive positions. Then, Soviet infantry and armor would assault from multiple directions. French and German defenders would fight building to building, inflicting casualties but steadily losing ground. When positions became untenable, survivors would withdraw to the next village, and the process would repeat. By March 2nd, the strategic situation had deteriorated catastrophically. Soviet forces had broken through German lines at multiple points. Entire divisions were encircled. The front had dissolved into isolated pockets, fighting without coordination or prospect of relief. At a farmhouse serving as temporary headquarters southwest of Neustetten, a command crisis erupted between General Edgar Puaud and SS Brigade Führer Gustav Krukenberg. Puaud advocated consolidating surviving French units and conducting an organized fighting withdrawal westward toward the Baltic coast. The plan was tactically sound and operationally achievable. It meant abandoning territory but preserving combat power for future operations. Krukenberg held different orders from Berlin. Every town was to be defended. Every position was to be held. There would be no voluntary withdrawals without explicit authorization from higher command. Units retreating without orders would be considered mutinous. The disagreement was not resolved through discussion. Krukenberg assumed direct operational control, bypassing Puaud and the French command structure. From this point forward, German officers gave orders directly to French battalion and company commanders. The French general staff retained nominal authority but possessed no actual control. For soldiers in forward positions, this command reorganization was largely irrelevant. They were already operating independently at company and platoon level. Higher command, whether French or German, was an abstraction. What mattered was the enemy 200 meters away and the ammunition remaining in pouches. March 3rd to 4th, 1945. Fighting south of Belgard intensified as Soviet forces drove hard toward the Baltic coast. The strategic objective was to reach the sea and cut off German forces still operating in western Pomerania. Multiple Soviet armies were converging on the region from different directions. Elements of the French 57th Regiment, including Henri Fenet's battalion, established defensive positions in villages along the approach routes to Belgard. They held approximately 120 men, the remnants of 4 companies that had been consolidated after heavy losses during the previous week. Soviet artillery preparation began at 11:45 hours on March 3rd. Katyusha rocket launchers added their distinctive screaming projectiles to the bombardment. The barrage lasted 40 minutes and destroyed most buildings in the village the French were defending. At 12:30 hours, Soviet tanks and infantry attacked from the northeast. This time, the assault was conducted properly according to Soviet combined arms doctrine, using the tanks as mobile cover. Infantry suppressed French positions with automatic weapons fire while tanks engaged with main guns. French defenders fought from rubble and ruins. Machine guns engaged Soviet infantry. Panzerfaust teams destroyed individual tanks at close range, but one tank destroyed made no strategic difference when more advanced behind it. By 14:20 hours, with Soviet forces controlling half the village, Fenet ordered withdrawal to secondary positions 400 meters west. The retreat was conducted under fire. 8 French soldiers were killed during the withdrawal. The remainder established new positions in another village and waited for the Soviet assault to resume. The pattern repeated throughout March 3rd and 4th. Bombardment, assault, defense, withdrawal. Every engagement reduced French strength by 10 to 30%. There were no replacements. The only mathematical direction was toward zero. Wehrmacht intelligence assessments from March 4th estimated the Charlemagne Division retained approximately 35% of its original strength. Over 4,000 casualties in less than 3 weeks, killed, wounded, missing, or incapacitated by frostbite and disease. The survivors were exhausted beyond normal human limits. Sleep was measured in minutes, not hours. Food was irregular. Medical supplies were exhausted. Wounded men received minimal treatment. Many died from injuries that would have been survivable with proper medical care. The worst, however, was yet to come. March 5th, 1945. General Edgar Puaud made his decision in the early morning darkness. Soviet forces were advancing rapidly. They were now within 20 kilometers of the Baltic coast. German forces in western Pomerania, including the remnants of the Charlemagne Division, were being encircled in a shrinking pocket. If they did not break out immediately, they would be trapped. Puard ordered a withdrawal westward across the Belgard plain, beginning at 5:30 hours. The plan required approximately 2,000 French soldiers, all that remained combat effective from the original 7,000, to cross 15 kilometers of mostly open terrain to reach German defensive positions near the coast. Success depended on several factors. First, early morning fog was common in March in Pomerania. If fog provided concealment, the withdrawal could proceed undetected. Second, movement had to be completed before dawn, when visibility increased and Soviet aircraft became active. Third, Soviet ground forces had to fail to detect the movement in time to intercept. Orders went out through the fragmented communication network. Battalion commanders prepared their units. Wounded who could walk would withdraw with their units. Wounded who could not walk would be left behind with medical personnel who volunteered to stay. Heavy weapons that could not be carried would be destroyed in place. At 5:30 hours, under heavy fog that reduced visibility to less than 50 meters, the withdrawal began. French soldiers moved in company-sized columns spaced several hundred meters apart. The spacing reduced vulnerability to artillery fire if the movement was detected. Navigation was by compass bearing. No lights were used. Talking was forbidden. Movement relied on soldiers following the man in front and trusting that someone at the column head knew the correct direction. Temperature was approximately -10°C. The frozen ground crunched under boots despite attempts at quiet movement. Artillery fire that had been constant for days had stopped. The silence was more unnerving than bombardment. For 3 hours, the withdrawal proceeded without incident. The fog held, no Soviet forces were encountered. By 08:30 hours, the French columns had covered approximately 8 kilometers, slightly more than half the distance to safety. Morale began to improve. Perhaps they would escape the trap. At approximately 8:50 hours, the sun rose above the horizon. Within minutes, temperature began increasing. The fog, which had provided perfect concealment, began to thin. By 9:15 hours, the fog had dissipated completely. 2,000 French soldiers were exposed on open ground across the Belgard plain in multiple columns with minimal cover except scattered tree lines and slight terrain undulations. At 9:23 hours, Soviet aircraft appeared from the northeast. The Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft was the most produced military aircraft in history, with over 36,000 manufactured, heavily armored, carrying 23mm cannons, machine guns, and bombs or rockets. It was specifically designed for destroying ground targets. German soldiers called it the Schwarze Tod, Black Death. 6 Sturmoviks appeared, flying low and fast. The French columns had no anti-aircraft weapons, no protection. The only option was to scatter and seek whatever minimal cover existed. The first aircraft made its attack run at 9:24 hours, diving on a French column with cannons firing. The 23mm explosive shells tore through human bodies. Men were killed instantly. The aircraft pulled up and circled for another pass. The second Sturmovik attacked a different column. More cannon fire. Small bombs tumbled from external racks and exploded among running soldiers. The attacks were methodical and systematic. French soldiers ran toward any cover, low rises, tree clusters, small depressions, but the Belgard plain offered minimal concealment. The Sturmoviks made repeated passes, working over the scattered columns with cannons and rockets. At 9:40 hours, Soviet armor appeared on the northern horizon. Approximately 15 T-34 tanks were advancing rapidly across the frozen ground. They had detected the French withdrawal and were moving to cut off the escape route. The French columns dissolved into complete chaos. Some units attempted to form hasty defensive positions. Others ran. Some froze in place. Officers shouted orders that could not be heard over aircraft engines and tank guns. All organizational cohesion collapsed. General Edgar Puard was with a column that included horse-drawn wagons carrying wounded soldiers. When the tanks appeared, he ordered increased speed, a futile gesture since horses cannot outrun tanks. At approximately 9:55 hours, Soviet tanks opened fire on the wagons from 800 meters. High explosive shells killed horses and overturned wagons, spilling wounded men into the snow. The tanks continued firing systematically. Multiple witnesses reported seeing Poord at approximately 10-15 hours. He was wounded, possibly by aircraft fire, possibly by shell fragments. He was on foot, moving toward a tree line approximately 200 meters distant. He walked slowly, one hand pressed against his side. He did not run. He entered the tree line and disappeared. His body was never recovered. His exact fate remains unknown. He may have been killed by Soviet troops during mopping up operations. He may have died from wounds in the forest. He may have been captured and died in Soviet captivity. The historical record is silent. General Edgar Poord, commander of French volunteers on the Eastern Front, walked into the fog of war and vanished from history. The destruction of French columns on the Belgard plain continued for approximately 90 minutes. Soviet aircraft attacked until they exhausted ammunition, then returned to reload and attacked again. Soviet tanks overran attempted defensive positions. Soviet infantry, following behind the armor, captured or killed survivors. By 1100 hours, the engagement was over. Approximately 600 French soldiers had been killed on the Belgard plain. Another 400 were wounded and captured. Perhaps 300 escaped by dispersing into small groups and moving cross-country through forests and swamps, avoiding roads and open ground. The remaining 700 soldiers scattered across Pomerania would continue fighting as independent groups for another week, but the 33rd Waffen-Grenadier Division der SS Charlemagne had effectively ceased to exist as a military formation. Its command structure was destroyed, its organizational cohesion was dissolved, its combat power was exhausted. Survivors of the Charlemagne Division arrived at Kurlin in small groups over 48 hours. They came from different directions, having escaped the Belgard catastrophe through various routes. Some had walked alone through forests, others had moved in small groups. All were exhausted. SS Brigade Führer Gustav Krukenberg consolidated approximately 400 combat-effective French personnel at Kurlin and established a defensive perimeter. The town sat astride a major road leading to the Baltic coast, approximately 15 kilometers inland. The defensive mission was to hold the town long enough for refugees and retreating military units to pass through. Krukenberg estimated this required holding 48 to 72 hours. Kurlin in peacetime housed perhaps 5,000 civilians. By March 1945, it was clogged with tens of thousands of refugees fleeing westward. Old men, women, children, pushing carts and carrying belongings. They streamed through the town continuously, moving toward the coast and evacuation by sea. The defensive perimeter incorporated whatever troops were available: Charlemagne survivors, scattered Wehrmacht units, Volkssturm militia, even naval personnel pressed into ground combat. Total defensive strength was perhaps 800 men defending a perimeter of several kilometers. SS Hauptsturmführer Henri Fenet commanded the French defensive sector on the eastern approach with approximately 120 men. These represented survivors from his original battalion plus stragglers from other units. Defensive preparations were basic. Buildings were sandbagged, machine guns were positioned to cover approach routes, Panzerfaust teams occupied upper floors with good fields of fire, anti-tank ditches were dug where the frozen ground permitted. Civilians continued passing through French positions throughout March 8th and 9th. An elderly woman stopped near Fenet's position and asked why French soldiers were fighting in Germany. Fenet had no answer that satisfied her or himself. March 10th, 1945, 05:30 hours, Soviet artillery opened fire on Kurlin. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes and systematically destroyed defensive positions across the perimeter. Buildings collapsed, fires started. French soldiers sheltered in cellars and basements, enduring the barrage because there was no alternative. At 700 hours, Soviet tanks and infantry attacked from the east. 20 T-34s led the assault, supported by multiple infantry companies advancing in waves. Soviet doctrine emphasized overwhelming force concentrated on narrow frontages to achieve breakthrough. Once penetration was achieved, exploitation forces would pour through the gap and destroy defensive cohesion from within. French defensive fire engaged at maximum range. Machine guns fired at 300 meters, rifles engaged at 200 meters. Soviet infantry absorbed casualties and continued advancing. When one wave was decimated, another replaced it. At approximately 7:35 hours, Soviet tanks closed to within 200 meters of French positions. Panzerfaust teams opened fire. Multiple rockets were fired. Some missed, some hit and penetrated, some hit and failed to penetrate due to poor angle of impact. French anti-tank teams destroyed 4 Soviet tanks and damaged 2 others during the initial assault phase. But individual tank kills did not halt the overall attack. More armor continued advancing behind the destroyed vehicles. At 8:15 hours, Soviet forces penetrated the southern edge of Fenet's defensive sector. Street fighting erupted. Grenades were thrown through windows. Submachine guns fired in rooms and hallways. Combat occurred at ranges where men could see each other's faces. Fenet was wounded during the fighting. A submachine gun burst struck his left arm, shattering bone. He wrapped the arm in a makeshift bandage and continued directing defense with his right hand. The fighting continued throughout March 10th. Soviet forces attacked repeatedly. French defenders held some positions and abandoned others. Ground was lost and occasionally recaptured through local counterattacks. Both sides fed men into a grinding attrition battle. March 11th brought renewed Soviet assaults. Artillery preparation resumed at dawn. Infantry attacks followed. By evening, French positions had been compressed into a shrinking perimeter. Casualties mounted, ammunition stocks depleted. On the evening of March 11th, Krukenberg visited Fenet's command post in a cellar. He informed Fenet that refugees and military units had successfully passed through Kurlin. The defensive mission was complete. French units were authorized to withdraw to the coast. Approximately 30 of Fenet's original 120 men remained combat effective. March 12th to 13th, 1945. French survivors conducted fighting withdrawals toward the Baltic coast. Some units moved in organized groups. Others dissolved into individuals and small teams moving independently through forests and along secondary roads. Soviet forces pursued but did not press aggressively. They had achieved their operational objectives, cutting off German forces in western Pomerania and reaching the Baltic. Mopping up isolated pockets could be conducted methodically without risking additional casualties in aggressive pursuit. March 13th, 1945. French survivors reached the Baltic coast. Soviet forces were visible on the horizon, approaching from the east. Some survivors attempted to reach Kolberg, 20 kilometers north, where German evacuation operations were still ongoing. Others simply stopped moving, too exhausted to continue. Of approximately 7,000 French volunteers deployed to Pomerania in mid-February, perhaps 700 to 1,000 survived to reach the coast. Some would be evacuated by sea to Denmark or northern Germany in the final weeks before Germany's surrender. Others would be captured when Soviet forces reached the shoreline. A few would die from wounds or exposure in the final days. The 33rd Waffen-Grenadier Division, der SS Charlemagne, had been destroyed in 4 weeks of combat. It had delayed Soviet forces by days. It had held defensive positions, allowing refugees and military units to withdraw. It had fought with determination against overwhelming material superiority. And their next battle would be for Germany's capital, the Battle of Berlin.